I'm JG Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, before we begin this edition of the program, I want to remind you that you can support this show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. I want to apologize to one of my $10 and above tier supporters right now, Darko. There was an oversight and I forgot to add you into the producer's credits section. So if that happens to anyone else, let me know, and apologies to you, Darko. It was an oversight on my end, and I really regret it. I don't know how it happened, actually. Oversights will happen occasionally. Sometimes I don't get emails from Patreon about new subscribers, or I overlook those emails, I miss them for some reason. So again, my apologies, Darko. With that out of the way, on this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from returning guest, Jacob Silverman, author of a really interesting article from the June issue of The Nation magazine entitled Coin Operated, the Crypto Industry's Takeover of American Politics. We'll be talking all about that piece, all about crypto, scams, and politics, as well as his recent trek to the Las Vegas cryptocurrency convention. What happened there? What went down there? Find out in the following conversation with Jacob Silverman. And with that being said, let's get right to it with Jacob Silverman. Welcome back to Parallax Views, one of my favorite guests. He has been tracking the fraudsters of big tech, I would say, and Silicon Valley and the Bitcoin world. Jacob Silverman is the author of Terms of Service, Social Media, and the Price of Constant Connection, and the co-author of Easy Money, Cryptocurrency, Casino Capitalism, and the Golden Age of Fraud. And he has a new piece in The Nation magazine entitled Coin Operated. I believe that's in the print edition. And then you can also read it online under the title The Rise of the Crypto Keepers. And he recently went to a Bitcoin conference. So we're going to be talking about both that experience and this article in The Nation. How are you doing, Jacob Silverman?
I'm good, thanks.
And I forgot to mention, you have a new book coming out, I think, in October, right?
Yeah, it's about the rise of the tech right in the last election and some of the things we're going to talk about today. It's called Gilded Rage, Elon Musk and the Radicalization of Silicon Valley. It's available for pre-order if you'd like to do that sort of thing.
So let's start with the Vegas Bitcoin convention. What was this convention all about?
So there is basically, I mean, there are, of course, tons of crypto conferences or even Bitcoin specific ones, but there's sort of a main one put on by Bitcoin magazine, and there's I think a foundation and company associated with it of a similar name, but it's kind of the house publication almost of Bitcoin. But I went in 2022 when it was in Miami and been in Miami for a while. Last year in 2024, it was in Nashville. And so you might get a little cat in either in the frame or in the audio, but he's wandering around. Anyway, last year it was in Nashville, and it was a big deal, relatively speaking, because that was where Trump spoke there, and it was kind of the seemingly at the time at least the capstone kind of his Bitcoin conversion, of his orange pilling, and of the huge monetary support of the crypto industry that had assembled behind him. It was before he became, kind of a full-time crypto entrepreneur. Anyway, this year it was in Vegas. The top speaker or top billing might have been Vice President J.D. Vance, but also a lot of big industry people, some people who frankly wouldn't have been who would not have come to the U.S. before, let's say, for legal reasons, and also some Ross Ulbricht, kind of symbolically, the founder of the Silk Road, who was pardoned by Trump. So it was in Vegas this year with like all that entails. and it was just last week, the last week of May.
So, what was your experience like there?
Well, crypto has always leaned right in one way or another, and there's certainly the kind of more libertarian right cypherpunk uh spectrum there, but a lot of that feels gone or superseded by really just MAGA and pro-Trump right feeling very prominent. There's a real there. First of all, there are so many Republican politicians. The first full day was more of an industry day, but it was called Code and Country, and there were maybe a dozen elected officials, senators, members of Congress, some people from the White House, David Sachs, Cynthia Loomis, Marsha Blackburn, all these people, and then their allies in the crypto industry, like the Winklevi, and various people from Coinbase and other places. Brian Armstrong wasn't there, but I think another Coinbase executive was there. Anyway, it just felt like this real union of kind of some of big tech, but also like finance and the corporate side of crypto and MAGA. And there was a lot of expression of thanks towards Trump for kind of delivering them all from lawfare. Actually, one of the narratives that you heard a lot was that, you know, Donald Trump was this victim of lawfare by the Democrats, and
And so were we, the crypto
right,
keepers.
exactly. And they expanded a little bit, like the Trumps, Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump expand, and some of these others expanded to talk about like, oh, we were debanked. The Winklevoss twins said that too, or our free speech was oppressed, so that's why we have to be on Rumble while talking to the Rumble founder. But broadly, it's like, Donald Trump is the force at the top, and in some ways the victim at the top, and they all kind of suffered under the same regime, and now they've been delivered from that. And Bitcoin is both a practical thing because some of them were losing their bank accounts, but also just this proxy for freedom.
Out of curiosity, and this is kind of a big picture question, but I've often wondered, I had David Columbia on my show back when he was alive, rest in peace.
Yeah.
He wrote The Politics of Bitcoin and how it sort of ties into a sort of right-wing, libertarian, and even authoritarian right sort of ethos. But I've always found it very interesting. I think there's a type of conservative that would be put off by Bitcoin. I'm not sure what like a Russell Kirk or an Edmund Burke would think of Bitcoin, but I'm pretty sure they'd be skeptical of it. So it's always led me to this question of why does so much of the right embrace Bitcoin?
Well, I mean, I think David Columbia was wonderful, and everything he wrote still stands. I think it's that somehow, I mean, I think the motivator in some ways is money. Is that, yes, we're talking about Bitcoin, but we're also talking about people getting rich, or in the case of the Republican Party, um, well, you have Trump personally enriching himself enormously off of crypto, but then the party benefiting a lot from the crypto industry's money in the last election cycle. So it's kind of adjacent enough, and and there is certainly an kind of an anti-government tradition, or like in the Republican Party, or John Bircher types who kind of, and some of these guys are kind of latter-day digital gold bugs or something, but it's close enough and money talks, so that I think cap and add in a little bit of the fact that the Republican Party is sort of the party of big business and corporate life in general. Not that the Democrats are immune to that, but it all comes together pretty nicely for the Republicans. I mean, there still may be members of the Republican Party or some elected officials who aren't fully down with the program, but even on things like the Genius Act, which is the stablecoin bill being debated, which I think will eventually pass in some form. I think every Republican is behind it. I'd be surprised if one is not. So, those factors coming together, I'd say, has made it pretty easy. There was this panel, like, there was one, like, what was it called? Are Bitcoiners becoming sycophants of the state? And I saw part of it, and the early consensus of the panelists was no, but it was sort of some of those old school cypherpunk and maybe conspiratorial right kind of guys on the panel. And I
Yeah,
think
it's
so,
it's really interesting because I think there
yeah.
is like some weird ties between the sort of original Bitcoin proponents and like anti-Federal Reserve conspiracy theorists, and that's often
Yeah,
overlooked.
and it's still there, like and even like in the sort of merch and art area, like there was this sort of, I talked to this lady who was very nice, but telling me about her poster, which was basically anti-Semitic, about like it showed all these Jewish bankers, like you could make out George Soros, who she identified, and then she started naming all these Rothschilds. I didn't even know all their names, but and it was this whole tableau of them like controlling the world economy on the backs of workers. But anyway, she was very cheerful about it, and I was like, this is like this is almost like a throwback kind of she was talking about 33rd degree Masons also, and it was sort of a throwback to a kind of anti-Federal Reserve, that kind of conspiratorial libertarian right stuff.
Did anyone there know who you were? Like, were you outed at all, or?
Not really. I talked to some other journalists, but no. I mean, I frankly I co-wrote a book that took place a little bit at the 2022 conference and probably had some criticism of it, but and certainly of the industry, but no one seemed to care. I would say like it is better run than it used to be, but I think like anyone who worked there when I went in 2022, it is probably gone. They didn't have much of a media operation to speak of. This year was at the Venetian in Vegas. It was just like they had more going on. They had the vice president there. It wasn't like the pinnacle of organization or whatever, but it was more of a professional operation.
You were saying earlier how there's sort of this narrative amongst Bitcoiners that, yeah, lawfare was used against us, just like lawfare was used against Trump. We are the victims. We are being witch hunted, which is kind of amusing given that, as far as I understand, there was a lot of harassment of Biden era officials who challenged Bitcoin and the crypto types in any way. I mean, right down to like harassment and doxing.
Yeah, and that's something I talk about in that Nation article, which is there was a real sense among certainly people at the SEC, who I think mostly consider, you have to understand that, of course, that everything I say would be immediately disputed by a crypto partisan or a crypto industry person. But the picture from this side is that, these sober-minded professionals at the SEC who basically are trying to see like, okay, can the current laws and regulations be applied appropriately to these crypto companies? And it's not their job to make new laws for the crypto companies. It's to say, hey, you have to comply. And they thought that the crypto companies were not only refused to comply with the laws and regulations as they stood, but were aggressive in a way that no industry really had been, at least in recent times. And that included also, a fan base who maybe independently was very activated, and people would get doxxed, but you also had more official kind of acts of retaliation, I guess you might say. Like Brian Armstrong, the CEO of Coinbase, has said that, especially after the election, that he won't hire or do business with any law firms who hire lawyers that were at the SEC. And look, the revolving door is everywhere, but like it's certainly common for someone to go from the SEC in one administration to then go to a private firm and then maybe end up doing some industry work. And he's basically saying, if you even touch the SEC, I won't deal with you. And you see the same kind of retaliation actually going on within the SEC itself, where like one of their top litigator was transferred basically to the IT department. And this kind of stuff is really unusual, both how it was happening under Biden, this like retaliation and
Can I just add to
threats.
that real quick? I
Oh,
think
sure,
it even
sure.
had, I think it was Corey Freer, who's the
Yeah.
senior advisor to former Securities and Exchange Commission Chair Gary Gensler saying, this isn't even the type of thing you see from the traditional financial services industry, even when those traditional aspects of the industry can be very confrontational, especially when there's cases against them. It's just unheard of, I think, is what he said in the article.
Yeah, and I've found him, very reasonable in presentation and experience on this stuff. And I think there's a lot at stake, of course, when the SEC is negotiating with a company or something like that. But there is a certain level of decorum and professionalism that's kind of understood, even if, behind that there's a lot of money or the force of law. And these crypto companies would come in and they would say, like, look, under current market structures, you have to separate out these aspects of your companies because you're basically performing all these functions at once. It's a little academic, but you're performing all these functions at once that in like the stock market or traditional equities and commodities markets here in the US are divided into various functions. Now, people still make a lot of money by, having an interest in one or more of those things, but they can't have the whole market vertically integrated under, Coinbase or whatever. And I mean, Coinbase happens to be a company that abides by this stuff because it's publicly traded, but they had all these meetings and all these crypto companies came in and they all left saying like they feeling oppressed while the SEC was like, well, you obviously won't abide by these laws or break up your operations because that's how you're making money. Like that's key to your operations. And that's like the fundamental divide and the refusal for basically industry to to adopt the laws that as they stood, and so they had to change them.
I hope you don't mind if I ask a really basic question, but you note in your article that liberals are divided on crypto. Some are in the industry's pocket, others are afraid of the industry's growing clout. But the thing I wanted to hone in on was some just simply don't understand it, or they think that, well, there has to be something there. There has to be a real innovation to cultivate. And I think that's an interesting point because there are people that aren't even liberals that feel that way about it. I think that in America, we try to have this sort of optimism, and we like the idea of innovation. So whenever there's a hype around a new industry saying we're going to innovate, we're going to change the world, I think a lot of people can be drawn to that hype. So if someone is completely unaware of the issues with the crypto industry, what would you say to them? What is the main critique that you would offer for people that just don't really understand any of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, sometimes I try to start from what I think are first principles, which this isn't really something that people in crypto ball are talking about, but crypto is basically private money, and for all of its faults, I think that the state should have authority over the money supply, and that money is political. And our history with private money, such as it is, like, isn't that great. And I think a lot of conversation could kind of flow from there, or I could talk about, some of those specific problems with that, or why I think fraud is kind of endemic to crypto.
I want to get
Um,
into the like
yeah,
specifics just for so like
sure.
if you were trying to say to someone who isn't really in the crypto world or they don't follow any of this, like what would be an instance you would point towards that would say, hey, this is something we need to worry about?
Well, let's see. I mean, I think you could say broadly they haven't achieved any of the goals that they set for themselves as an industry, and their sort of narrative of what they are ch seems to change every 6 months to a year, whether it's it's a currency or medium of exchange or store of value or whatever else. But also, I think sometimes I joke. I mean, it's a little tautological, but like if you were gonna when especially when these guys were complaining under the Biden administration, crypto people, like if you were going to build the future of finance, you would have built it already. And I think they've been given a lot of chances. And I mean, now they're going to be given the ultimate chance, which is everything they want under the Trump administration and the Republicans. But crypto in general is as old as the iPhone, and has, I think, you know achieved pop cultural renown, certainly. Like, and you can say that if you're long on Bitcoin, you just say like, well, Bitcoin's the best performing asset of the last decade, case closed. That's the kind of stuff I heard at the convention last week. But it hasn't brought about shared prosperity or changed economies in fundamental ways, unless you're North Korea, and that's not a total joke. And
It's also led to a lot of people losing a lot of money and
Yeah,
getting scammed.
and I think you also have to like in some ways measure outcomes. I mean, you can be rigorously quantitative if you want, which is difficult actually at times in crypto, but you can also say because the numbers aren't trustworthy, but most people have lost money. Most markets are not trustworthy or are rigged in some ways or dominated by wash trading. There is an You'll always hear from them, well, there's fraud and fiat and people commit money laundering through TD Bank and stuff, which like, yeah, that there was a big case there earlier this year, but fiat also underpins everything. Whereas pound for pound or per capita or however you want to break it down, the amount of sort of fraud and bad actors in crypto is way disproportionate. I think honest people know by now it's because of the way the system is designed, and also that is intentional. That the basic value add is like the legal arbitrage of crypto is that you are going into a parallel, poorly regulated financial system where you can basically transmit money or something like it, and you might, pay a tax on it, which one does when money laundering, but that's the fundamental value. I mean, there are people who will talk about the technology or kind of new forms of economic exchange or the speed of it or something like that. But what sustains it, I think, is the fact that it is this gray market that people can transit in and out of.
In a lot of ways, the story you wrote in The Nation, Coin Operate It, reads like a chronicle of systemic capture. At what point did you realize this wasn't just a story? I mean, the Bitcoin issue in general wasn't just a story about financial scams. I mean, in a way, it's about political transformation.
Yeah, I think yeah, well, I think Bitcoin's use cases along the way, especially in the sort of the way I talk about it, is crime, basically, and that doesn't. We don't always have to attach a moral valence to that or really debate that. I mean, obviously, some crimes are worse than others, and whatever it might facilitate. But like, um, I talked one thing I've heard from people before is like Ross Ulbricht was so celebrated, the founder of the Silk Road, because he provided a use case for Bitcoin. He onboarded people like that people use that language and they celebrate him for that. I mean, some people
Did
like
you say
kind
Ross Ulbricht?
yeah, the founder of the Silk Road who was pardoned and then spoke at the Bitcoin conference, but and was very much mythologized while he was away in prison. But it was really, I think, in a lot of people's minds, or what I've heard from some folks, is because like he helped create a market for the thing and a use case, and that's always been the challenge. And the word that is often used is he onboarded people, and like the Silk Road was one of the great onboarding events in Bitcoin history. And so, sorry, I forget your question that prompted me to go there. But
I was asking about how this isn't just about political. This
oh
isn't
yes,
just
yeah.
about financial scams.
Oh,
It's
so
political transformation and
right. So
systemic
what
capture.
what I want to say to connect that to politics is that I actually think that the use case in some ways is still crime. It's just it's drugs and money laundering, sanctions evasion, that sort of thing, human trafficking, like grim stuff. But it's now we see kind of the political corruption and the political crime that can be facilitated not by crypto in particular, and it's both the Trump becoming basically this crypto entrepreneur who anyone can put money in his pocket, but it's also the last election and how the crypto industry was able to raise more than $200 million for Trump and mostly Republican candidates, and that was basically enough to capture them.
So your article starts out talking about shit coins. if people don't know what shitcoins are, what are shitcoins, and how did this end up coming up with Representative Sean Casten, the Illinois Democrat who sits on the House Financial Services Committee, when he was questioning cryptocurrency industry executives at a public hearing?
Yeah, I found Rep Caston pretty. I hadn't met him before really, but I thought he was pretty sharp on some of the stuff. I mean, this is a separate topic, but some of these representatives do seem uninformed, and there are sources out there for them. That there are
And
small
this
little.
hearing was about the president of the United States launching a meme coin, right?
Right. This was about the Trump coin. And so because of the rules of decorum in the Congress, he could not say shit coin, so he called it fecal coin. And
If
but
people don't know, just I'm not trying to interrupt you too much, but
sure,
what does
sure.
shitcoin mean?
Pardon me. A shit coin is just like also called a meme coin, is just a token that's spun up basically in a moment. There are automated systems that will do it for you online. You don't have to pay. A cryptocurrency token that's like named after a pop culture phenomenon or whatever you want. And it has no inherent value. There was like the Haktua lady had a coin, or Pepe the Frog, or name any sort of thing that's gone viral, and there's probably been a coin formed around it. And there are people who trade on these, and a few people who might make some money, but mostly they're used for scams and pump and dumps, and people kind of gamble. They're kind of the slot machines almost of the crypto economy.
So you get people to buy into it and then you dump it.
Within minutes, often. Like there's a website called pump.fun, which I don't necessarily recommend connecting your bank account to it, but people can just spin up a meme coin on there, and it had all these. They took away some of, I think, the features, but it has all these social media kind of integrations, and it's almost like a communal game where like there are hundreds or thousands of tokens spun up each day, and people bet on them, and most of them disappear, or like will go to a few cents or a few bucks, and then they're gone within minutes. The unusual thing about like Dogecoin or the Trump coin are those are kind of shit coins that lasted. They still fluctuate wildly. They still have no inherent value, but they're worth something, and people still gamble on them.
So Kasten ends up bringing this up, and it leads to yet another shitcoin. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, so he mentions in this hearing he's trying to ask these executives like, hey, some of you call these things shitcoins, right?
And he can't call them shitcoins because
But
of decorum.
it's the U.S. Congress and there are rules, so he calls it he's sort of winking and says, we'll call it a fecal coin, also called a meme coin or something like that, and people laugh, and he says, would you agree that these have no inherent value? And I don't know who the executive was, but it was a cryptocurrency industry executive says yes, like we agree basically, and people are laughing, but his point is, and then he says the president issued something that has no value. And then he goes on to talk about how the president was scamming people with his shitcoin. But of course, within I think a couple hours, I was trying to figure out the timing. I believe it was through Pump.Fun, but it was on the Solana blockchain, which Pump.Fun uses. There was someone made fecal coin, and it had Rep Caston's face on it, and there was something like $6 million of it, I believe. So like it was I found Twitter accounts and Telegram accounts devoted to it. Like it had all the trappings of like a quick meme coin pump and dump, and was really about this like offhand, barely viral moment that was on C-SPAN. And it was it's easy to sort of brush it aside, but I think what was interesting and what the congressman recognized was like this is a way in which like any moment now could kind of be monetized, and also people on the inside of something, especially a member of Congress, could participate in that. And
Right.
he
Well,
is
he could have done this himself. I mean, if it
exactly
wasn't
he's
for the
like
fact that he wasn't a critic of crypto
yeah,
lobby,
he's like
people
I'm
would
a
think,
well-known crypto critic, and this obviously baffled me, but like otherwise you probably should have been asking me like were you in on this? Because and he's very conscious of this and actually very concerned about his fellow members of Congress. One line that didn't really make it into the article, just not for any particular reason really, but like we were sort of talking about like, well, are you worried about people being paid under the table? Or I mean, we were already talking about the flood of crypto donations, in to his colleagues, and I was like, people actually being paid directly in some way in crypto. And he said, well, if it were happening, how would we know? And I think that's largely true. I mean, there are ways to sort of perhaps investigate this or suss it out, but I've said that like the next Senator Bob Menendez, is probably in office right now and getting crypto from, his handlers in Egyptian intelligence or whoever it might be, or whichever company is paying them off. It just has, as we see with Trump happening right in the open, it's become so convenient that you have to think it is happening.
If you could, it's really amazing reading about like this idea of the Federal Crypto Reserve and how much the Trump administration really wants to integrate this into mainstream, um, into the mainstream, more or less. Can you speak to that and what that entails?
Yeah, there's a kernel of this thing that I think is reasonable, or sort of the very first step, which is to take some kind of census or just accounting of how much crypto does the government own. Now, frankly, this may already be one of those things that's actually somewhat known by, a few people in the Treasury Department or some bureaucrats, but it's possible not, and it would be good to know. Because the government does seize a lot of, despite its, decentralized free reputation, it seizes a lot of crypto in criminal investigations. A lot of it ends up in the hands of the FBI, and then the Marshal Service, I think, custodies it, with Coinbase actually having a contract for that. And periodically they sell some of the Bitcoin into the market. But a lot of it is still somewhere in the proverbial hands of the government. But but they want to, beyond that, they want to put it all together, and basically they want to start adding to it in some way. Um, and they people like David Sachs at the crypto conference last week, or people representing the White House or Trump himself or industry executives, sometimes they talk about like, well, maybe they're value neutral ways of doing it. They claim there'll be no new spending. One thing I hadn't heard, a couple things that I heard at the conference that I hadn't quite heard before. Maybe they had said it the first one, which is that like, oh, we'll find programs that they'll basically find more of fraud, waste, and abuse, and things that shouldn't be getting money, and they'll redirect that to buying Bitcoin. I forget, that might have been Sachs who said that, but but the one I do remember for sure as being novel, and I hadn't heard before, is I believe it was Cynthia Loomis saying that there are these, like, the government has options or sort of these convertible gold notes. Again, this is something like, I think we're really digging into kind of the more esoteric uh, parts of the treasury here. And somehow she thinks that they could sell those and then buy Bitcoin. So basically just trying to say like, finding different loopholes or things that say like the government already owns this, or it's already going to spend the money, but let's redirect it towards Bitcoin. And I don't know what happens then, because when do you sell it? Are they trying to control the price, or like, is there a break glass in case of Bitcoin emergency thing going on?
I was gonna say, you mentioned Sachs. We're talking about David Sachs, the venture capitalist turned sort of crypto and AI czar. And I think you say specifically in the article that he sort of wants the federal government to start stockpiling digital tokens as a strategic asset. And this would be like potentially a disaster for all of us, especially when there's another crypto bubble bursting.
Yeah, I mean, the broad concern is the further integration of crypto, which is volatile and unstable, lacks inherent value, and has really rapid boom and bust cycles, into the mainstream economy. And so that when crypto goes down again, you have what they call contagion into the mainstream economy. And there are different ways in which kind of the integration of crypto into the mainstream economy can happen. And there were a lot of ways in which it was avoided in 2022 when FTX and others collapsed, and there was a bust then. But someone like David Sachs, who claims to not have personal crypto holdings, but certainly through a lot of his investments at Craft Ventures and elsewhere, has either direct or indirect exposure to Solana and other tokens. has talked about having a strategic Bitcoin or a strategic crypto stockpile of certain tokens that seem to be from politically connected companies and ones that he may be exposed to, like Solana, Ripple, aka XRP, a few others. Ethereum, Bitcoin will be in there too. But it seems to be tokens that are basically from that A16Z and other right-wing VCs are somehow exposed to or engaged in.
If you can stay on for a little bit longer, I have
Sure.
maybe two or three more questions. I felt like one of the most damning parts of your article is how many Democrats voted with Republicans on IRS reporting rollbacks, even knowing it was bad policy. How did Crypto's War Chest manage to silence opposition just so effectively?
That was, I think, was somewhat. I mean, we should be cynical to a certain degree, but I was pretty amazed at that. And I think Rep. Sean Casten, who told me about it for the article, was kind of amazed. He was certainly upset by it enough to tell me about it. So there was this vote. There's kind of a procedural kind of vote that they can use in Congress to overturn rules that have been recently established. And that basically it was a vote to overturn a reporting requirement for certain crypto companies towards the IRS. The kind of thing that just crypto people don't like. Not necessarily a core regulation, but one that probably is, on the side of consumer protection and 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 eventually taxing crypto too. So there was a vote on it, and Sean Casten is trying to whip his fellow Democrats, get them to vote along with him, and they're all pretty much saying the same thing. Like, look, I know that this we should probably vote to keep this rule, but I'm worried about the money that might come at me in the next cycle in 2026 because this is the House, so they're going to be up for re-election just next year, and they all saw what happened in 2024, and they know that some of their colleagues aren't there anymore. And they have names: Jamal Bowman, Katie Porter, these other people, um, and that's kind of it. And at the end, they lost by, I believe, 70 votes or more than 70 votes, and it's so striking. You don't expect much necessarily from the modern Democratic Party, but like, what's going to happen when the Genius Act or something really substantial is up there, or even something not crypto related, like. But still, with this kind of industry capture, it's so clear, and it's enough Democrats that you'll never really see the kind of united front that you need because, as I would argue, like this is not a normal industry, and this is one that like is Democrats' political adversary, and they want different things than the Democratic Party, broadly speaking. And the things that they want aren't even good for Democratic voters, ultimately in the end when we have the next crypto bubble burst. So,
I think
but
it's telling too the
yeah,
sort of Democrats that have worked with Republicans on being pro crypto, Gillibrand, Richie Torres. I mean, these are uh they come off as kind of shady to me, at least personally.
certainly. And I think they're disliked even by some Democrats who are, educate on the issue and like have their ducks in a row about like how to talk about it, how to vote on it, why this matters, and core issues of money and the law and fraud and political influence that are going on now. And ultimately, it's a little silly to say, but I'm a little heartened more recently that like how I hear some of these Democrats talking about Chris Murphy, Jamie Raskin, some others like Trump has, in a way, done us a service of just being so blatant and kind of
Well, weren't there
necessitating
even
a
weren't there even
denunciation.
not to
Yeah,
interrupt you, but weren't there even
please.
like MAGA types that were kind of put off by his promotion of the Trump
Yeah,
coin?
and Joe Lonsdale, who is, for example, who is a big MAGA guy and certainly up till now a friend of the administration, he tweeted something like, "I don't like pork or whatever it was, or like bad spending. I don't like dumb spending for lefty stuff, and I don't like it for right wing stuff." And he didn't like the crypto reserve. And David Sachs responded to him kind of a little angrily publicly on X. So like there are some of these guys that don't like it. or who find it just a little unseemly. Like it's the kind of attention that they don't want. Like we're doing fine.
Two more things here.
Sure.
In a lot of ways, crypto may be economically hollow, but for some reason, it's very culturally potent. And I think that's because it sort of taps into this aesthetics of rebellion. How does that get sort of hijacked or used by reactionary forces? How does it serve those forces? Because I think it really taps into a sort of like I said, this, oh, it's rebellious, it's, we're going against authority, even though it's serving powerful interests.
Certainly, and I think it's so important to note that and to note how like there are certain contradictions there that um coexist, or sort of keep going even if though people acknowledge them. But it's also why crypto is sort of well suited to like Trumpian false populism. I think still though crypto is one of the main sort of get rich quick schemes of our time, and that's
I
that's
would say
what
it is the get
it
rich
is,
quick
the one,
scheme.
right, of like the 21st century, and ultimately that's what it's about, is like people wanting, there are all sorts of economic motivators that are very understandable, like inflation, people not seeing much of a raise against inflation in decades, all kinds of ways in which most working people struggle to get ahead. And it's like one of the few things that promises that. So, but it can be adopted or sort of presented to different interest groups. Like if and some of this is called affinity fraud, but like I've seen, the reason why, frankly, crypto is statistically overrepresented in minority groups in the U.S., especially in Black and Latino groups, is because it's been presented to them and sold to them as like, look, the banks redlined you and have oppressed you. True. Here's the countercultural alternative. And this is something you hear a lot kind of on the new right also, or on the MAGA right, is that we're actually the new counterculture because we're sort of rebelling against existing institutions, even as they're often leveraging them or strengthening them. And so there are all kinds of ways in which I think crypto uh, adopts similar kinds of sort of fake countercultural narratives. And even though it's like a billionaire on stage telling you you're going to be rich, people kind of ignore the fact that it's a billionaire, and they find something else in it, or they find the fact that even though it might have those qualities we've talked about, it still promises to overthrow the existing order. The what it might bring might be a disaster, but that's enough for them. That's the reactionary instinct, I think, coming in, that's very appealing to a lot of people too.
I think for me, one of the most chilling parts of the article in a weird way was you quote Mark Hayes, warning that crypto isn't just a consumer protection issue. It's literally, from his vantage point, uh, a threat to our democratic values. Can you explain what he meant by that? Because I think that's really key to all of this and understanding why there's this criticism of criticism and skepticism of crypto.
Mhm. Well, I think we're seeing what it can bring. And again, the crypto industry would say like, well, we've been victimized, we haven't been able to sort of flourish to the extent that we can, or something like that. But we see in general that in practice, um, it generally brings crime and now political corruption. And it's each time I write an article lately, I have to sort of add another Trump crypto business or act of corruption that hadn't happened the last article I wrote. And I think at the time that Mark and I were talking, Trump already had the meme coin, but I think he was also thinking a lot about the last election, which really was dominated by crypto money and dominated by this industry that's not very economically productive. That the kind of change it's bringing actually benefits a very limited set of people, and that we've seen that. There's it's hard to dispute that, and that's I think one thing that seems sinister. And I think there's also this basic idea that again that um, when when we kind of give into, frankly, fundamentalist ideas about money or the right to transact, as some of these folks call it, that you know, basic democratic governance or aspects of democratic governance that we might find important break down. Like, there are a lot of things that we don't like about the banking system. It is also pretty heavily regulated and surveilled by the federal government in a certain way, which I do think contains some of its excesses. And those kinds of sacrifices are simply, or those kinds of accommodations are simply not ones that this industry is willing to make. And so if you give over kind of economic authority and authority over the money supply to those kind of fundamentalist attitudes, bad things can start happening.
In closing, what's the worst case scenario with crypto? I mean, I was sort of thinking while reading this, if another crypto crash is looming, this time with crypto embedded in pensions, public balance sheets, and even treasury reserves, that meltdown looks pretty bad. Am I going overboard thinking that?
Not at all. Like I felt like and this is coming out in an article. I'm writing for Business Insider, but about the conference. But I thought that the two big themes broadly at the conference recently were, and this is the biggest crypto conference in the world, were basically MAGA and alignment with the Republican Party and corporate balance sheets, and these some of them companies like MicroStrategy purely dedicated to accumulating Bitcoin. And beyond that, you have like ETFs, some of them shitcoin ETFs where like there's going to be a Trump coin ETF probably at some point soon where you can buy like your retirement account could be invested in basically a financial product whose value is linked to a shitcoin. And some of these have already been applied for. There was like a Bonk coin, which was a shitcoin that had a moment last year, I believe. Like you basically have all this vaporware almost like undergirding real funds, real like economic investments, and when some of that stuff starts to go, then yeah, like actually people's retirement accounts or big pension funds. I've written about there's a guy basically going around trying to get public workers pension funds to invest in Bitcoin, and he's starting or and actually private sector ones too, and he's starting to have some success. So when you have some of these sort of economic pillars there, then you get, some real breakage. People don't have their money or banks start failing.
Do you think, sorry, I keep adding questions,
That's
but,
fine.
is there anything that regulatory agencies like the SEC can do in this environment? Or, I mean, have they been defanged too much already?
Well, agencies have to enforce policy, I mean, and the law, but also there's a lot of latitude with policy and sort of discretion of the administration of what they want to be enforced. So, the Trump administration has already dismantled all these crypto task forces, some of them more criminally
Isn't that
focused.
wild, by the way? Because he used to be Mr. Anti-Crypto, Trump.
Yeah, oh yeah, that he famously said like that he thought crypto was a scam and it competed with the US dollar. He didn't like that about Bitcoin, which is actually relatively true. Um, but he obviously saw the light, and these immediate acts to fire the 18 inspector generals, which no one really talks about that much, but people did make a big deal of it at the time, and then to dismantle all these task forces, say they're not going to enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Like it's basically legal now to bribe a foreign president if you want. I guess to bribe Trump too. Um, all these sorts of things like it's at the discretion of the administration of the president. But what it's also different this time is that, like I say in my article, people at some of these agencies are being punished for enforcing the last administration, the Biden administration's policies. And so some of those people are being fired, some of them are being moved to dead-end jobs, or maybe just picked upon or pressured to go out. I think there are a lot of people, especially like in the Justice Department, um, who would like to, be career public officials, who think like, okay, good time and bad. I'm still like a Justice Department prosecutor and kind of believe in this stuff. But they're getting to certain points where, like, obviously people are resigning, and there are a lot of people wondering, how long can I hang on if it's such a politicized environment, and you're punished for things that loyally following orders, I guess.
Well, hey, I think that's a great note to end on. What do you hope that my listeners get out of this piece, and more fully your work on Bitcoin and sort of the tech oligarchs? What's the one thing you want my listeners to understand?
Uh, I think I try to follow the money and listen to what they say and take them seriously at their word. I think that's a good starting point with these guys.
Hey, by the way, are there any libertarians that are starting to turn on Bitcoin? I know that Peter Schiff was like really critical of Bitcoin and like lost his mind over his son Spencer getting into Bitcoin, and I think his son now is anti-Bitcoin too. Is there a changing of the tide?
Peter Schiff had a weird thing where I don't know exactly what his business interest might be in relation to it, but he was at the conference and he was on a panel. He has sort of made himself into this professional antagonist of Bitcoin, where I think it's kind of he has this sort of sideline where he now is like, okay, I'm going to go around debating the Bitcoin guys. And I don't know if he gets paid to show up, but like he was on a panel. He does. It was like two gold bugs on different sides of Bitcoin debating each other. Then I saw him at a party, like surrounded by all these women. Like he seems to have given in that way, and some of the Bitcoiners like joke around, like, "Oh, you've been orange pilled" and stuff. I do think there are some libertarians. Like I saw there was. I didn't end up talking to this guy, but there's an account. There are certainly other people you can find out there. I'm sure there are occasional people at the conference. There's a guy whose account I thought was pretty interesting on X called Pledditor, Pleddditor, and he's kind of an old school Bitcoin guy who's just like, you guys are all just authoritarians now, kneeling at the foot of the state, and like all these people suck and are scammers, and is basically just a Bitcoin purist. And I still hear from some people like that, like a lot of the like kind of mainstream Bitcoiners will block me or don't really care what I have to say, but like some of the people who on the kind of crypto side who still follow me happen to be like the kind of more OG or maybe intellectually grounded. It still might be in Bitcoiners. It might be in a philosophy I don't agree with, but that I still hear from some of those, and yeah, they don't like where it's going, but they have no authority really.
Well, hey, thanks again, Jacob Silverman, for coming on Parallax Views.
Appreciate it.
This edition of Parallax Views brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Kilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, WV, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Darko, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Saded 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.